And having had personal experience with these substances, I'm much less inclined to take the orthodox position that these are, simply hallucinations. I struggle. The experience and the entities, their intelligence, their power, the inordinate complexity of this space that you are taken to when you take DMT, leaves me confounded.
You're listening to Narcotica, a podcast giving you the straight dope about drugs and the people who use them.
Psychedelic drugs are weird, but DMT has to be one of the weirdest. Best known as the principal psychoactive ingredient in ayahuasca, this drug, called N-Dimethyltryptamine, occurs naturally in many plants and animals. It's commonly called the, quote, spirit molecule because while tons of psychedelics will offer spiritual insight, DMT is in a category all its own. It can allegedly transport you to another dimension where you'll be greeted by vibrating, chattering machine elves, as Terrence McKenna commonly called them. Are they aliens, spiritual beings, or just hallucinations? Whatever you decide, the experience is definitely life-changing and will only last about 15 minutes. I'm Troy Farah, and you're listening to Narcotica. Today in the program, I'm going to be speaking with Andrew Gallimore, a computational neurobiologist, pharmacologist, and DMT enthusiast. He is author of the new book, Alien Information Theory, and he lives in Okinawa, Japan. Andrew, welcome to the program.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Can you give listeners a little background on yourself and how you first encountered DMT? And also, I'd really like to hear what your definition of DMT is, because I assume it's different from the typical pharmaceutical description people are familiar with.
So 3 questions there. So, so as you said, I'm a computational neurobiologist. So I'm interested in the brain and the way the brain functions and the way that we can use computational techniques and mathematical techniques to kind of try and understand and even model and simulate what the brain does. So I'm interested in brain function at all levels, from the kind of the way the entire brain works, this huge super network of neurons, all the way down to what's happening inside individual brain cells, these complex subcellular networks of molecules that actually control the function of the cell. So that's kind of my current job title, if you like. But I come from my academic background is quite varied. I started off being really as a teenager. I guess that's where my interest in DMT comes from. Fascination with the way that drugs can interface with the brain and cause such astonishing changes in consciousness and how that relates to what's going on in the brain. So I was very interested in psychedelics from a teenager, and that kind of brought me into when I was thinking about my higher study. When I went to university, I initially drew me towards chemistry and pharmacology. That seemed to make sense, but as I kind of matured as a scientist and moved on to PhD and then now postdoctoral level, where I've been at for a few years, I became more interested in the neuroscience. So I've kind of got kind of formal training in what I consider to be the key fields, the key disciplines that are necessary for understanding psychedelics. Neuroscience, computational science to an extent, pharmacology, chemistry, all these kind of things. So that's me now. I currently work in Okinawa, as you said, but I don't, on a day-to-day basis anyway, I don't spend my time looking at psychedelics. I have kind of formal work that I do for the university, academic work, but in my spare time is what I devote to psychedelic drugs, and I'm devoting more and more of my time these days. And hopefully one day I'll be able to leave the academic job behind and become deinstitutionalized and actually spend all of my time thinking about psychedelics and writing about psychedelics. So DMT specifically, I regard it as the kind of the king of psychedelics. and describing what is DMT, you can go and you can approach that question from a number of different angles or levels, if you like. You can come at it from what one might say the orthodox neuropharmacological neuroscientific paradigm, and say, okay, DMT is a tryptamine psychedelic. It's a 5-HT2A partial agonist. It binds to these receptors. It causes these changes in the way that the neuron functions, and these has global effects on cortical dynamics, which is experienced as the psychedelic state. So that's the simple kind of elevator pitch, if you like, describing what DMT does to, or what really general classical psychedelics do in terms of brain function. They all seem to have this kind of common mechanism of action. But DMT is special, and I would go further when I talk about DMT. I would describe, as Terrence McKenna did, as DMT as being this reality switch, this 100% reality switch. And it does more than just change the structure of your world that you experience, but it actually flips the switch entirely and transforms it into an entirely different world that bears no real relationship to the normal kind of waking world. So that's, and going a little bit further from that, we could even say, okay, DMT is a technology for facilitating, transdimensional communication with, normally hidden orthogonal dimensions of reality, but that's going even further. And with every step away from that basic definition, I am leaving the orthodox neuroscientific arena, if you like, and heading into highly contentious territory.
Yes, contentious indeed. Speaking of which, what is the prevailing attitude towards psychedelics in Japan? What is it like living there? And you're originally from the UK, correct?
I am from the UK, yes. So I think Japan is no different from other Asian countries specifically. I think the problem with more generally with the war on drugs is that it kind of, for many years now, since long before I was born, it has prevented people from having any kind of rational discussion about drugs. In that there is no rationale behind people's opinions about certain drugs compared to other drugs, and it's become a truism now that people are perfectly happy for people to use drugs as long as it's alcohol and nicotine and caffeine. Anything beyond that, you're in kind of completely irrational territory where people have these opinions about these drugs. They're not really based on any kind of logic or evidence. They're simply based upon this kind of indoctrination of children that goes on in all societies, really. Certainly all kind of modern societies, but it seems to be progressing less quickly away from that in Asian countries. I mean, we're seeing now in Western countries, in America specifically, the UK, annoyingly, is still kind of holding on to these old ideas of why drugs are prohibited. But in America, at least, there's this separation, first of all, from different types of drugs in terms of their perceived harm. And this has given rise to the emergence of the Cannabis Legalization Act that have now kind of propagated and spread throughout many, many states in the United States, which of course is a welcome thing. But in Japan, there is still this idea that drugs are bad, and are very bad, and cannabis is not seen as any different to heroin or methamphetamine, in that it's associated with laziness and sluggishness and a poor work ethic. They have this idea that people who smoke a lot of weed are lazy and don't get anything done, which of course is completely counter to the traditional and completely stereotypical, but actually quite real Japanese work ethic. But with psychedelics, I think the majority of Japanese people probably wouldn't know much about them. So I don't think there's a strong within the kind of the Japanese population a strong opinion about them. They know about meth because the Japanese have a huge problem with methamphetamine, and they have done since the war.
Yeah. It was discovered there.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Originally. Yeah. It was synthesized. Yeah. Originally. I forget the name. Ogata, I think his name was. But anyway. Yeah. So they've had a huge meth problem. So they're understandably a little bit wary about methamphetamine, but it extends to pretty much all drugs, really. Yeah. I think there was a guy who was caught importing psilocybin mushrooms into Japan. It's just a package with some fresh mushrooms, and the judge gave him a very harsh sentence. And the words that he used, he described the mushrooms as that evil drug. So you can imagine the level that they're working at here. It's not on a rational, actually, what do these drugs do? How do they work? What are the risks? What are the potential benefits? No. It's like, these are evil drugs and must be stamped out.
Well, that's unfortunate.
Yeah, it's actually one of the, when I think about, I have a permanent residence in Japan, in that I can stay as long as I want. I could stay forever if I wanted to, but it's one of the things that makes me hesitant about settling in Japan permanently, is this kind of draconian attitude to drugs. It's one of, and the sense that if you got caught with magic mushrooms, you're probably going to end up in prison.
Yeah.
Hard labor.
To get back to DMT, you published a paper with Dr. Rich Strassman, the author of the book DMT, the Spirit Molecule. It's also made into a documentary. In the 1990s, Strassman administered approximately 400 doses of DMT to about 6 patients. He's partially credited as kickstarting the so-called second psychedelic revolution. And together you wrote this 2016 paper, which describes a method for making DMT trips last several hours. DMT is a very short-lived experience. To your knowledge, has this technique been used scientifically or otherwise?
The otherwise part I can't answer because I don't know. I'd be surprised if anybody would. The technology requires a special device. It's not just some people refer to it as like a continuous drip feed, but it's not a drip. It's a device, a machine that you program that delivers the DMT with a specific infusion rate over time, and this can be changed. In fact, it must be changed. So you can, you have a cannula that goes into the arm, into a vein in the arm, and this is plugged up to the machine which contains the DMT, and then you program in your infusion rate or your infusion rates, and that it will change over time, and then the machine then delivers the drug according to this specifically programmed infusion rate. And the fusion rate itself is based on a pharmacokinetic model that I developed, a mathematical model that models the way that DMT distributes through the body, the way it goes into the brain, the way that it's metabolized and broken down and removed from the body. So it's not trivial to do this kind of work. And the model that I produced, and when I wrote the paper with Rick, was really kind of proof of principle in that, what are the properties of DMT? It occurred to me that the pharmacological, what I think of as DMT's pharmacological peculiarities, give it certain properties that are required for anesthetic drugs, for these drugs that are used to keep someone asleep during surgery, in that they are very short-acting, as you say. They don't exhibit subjective tolerance, so the effect of them doesn't diminish over time, because that certainly complicates things. And then, they're non-toxic and they don't accumulate and all these kind of things. DMT has these special qualities that aren't shared by other psychedelic drugs. So it occurred to me that this target-controlled intravenous infusion, which is what its sort of technical name, technology that's used by anesthesiologists across the world, could actually be adapted or repurposed, if you like, to actually bring someone into this DMT state for extended periods of time. But as I say, the model was a proof of principle. It's not ready to go into humans. So what it would require is first of all some preliminary testing to see how the model actually performs in humans, which in itself is quite complex because all people are different. People are different sizes and ages, and their metabolisms differ and things like that. So, if the model works in one person, doesn't mean it's going to work in somebody else. Or modifications and elaborations and improvements to the model need to be made, which there are people now doing that. So there are certainly, I know of 3 or so groups that are actually seriously taking this model seriously and actually trying to implement it in humans. A purely academic team in the UK who are looking to use it for neuroimaging kind of studies. So very, very academic application of the technology. And then there are other groups who are more interested in, can we use this to communicate with alien intelligences from another dimension?
We'll come back to the aliens thing, but are you talking about Robin Carhart-Harris's team?
Yeah, exactly. So me and Rick were kind of consultants for their new DMT imaging work that they're doing at the moment. Well, they've just completed, actually. But when they were planning that, originally they were thinking about using continuous infusion. Because, if you want to use functional MRI in someone's brain, they have to be within the machine for a significant amount of time, depending on the techniques that are used. There are many different kind of MRI techniques that can be used nowadays. But obviously, if you want to keep someone there and perform experiments, maybe give them tasks to do whilst they're under the influence of DMT, it would be awesome if they could have a constant level of DMT in their brain, rather than this steep rise to breakthrough and then this rather rapid loss of DMT in the brain. So they were going to use our infusion model, but I think in the end they thought maybe it's a step too far at first. So they went with just the normal bolus injection, basically, so injecting all the DMT at once. But they're still working on improving our model using a specialist pharmacokineticist who can really do a much better job than I could do on this pharmacokinetic model and actually get it to the level where it really does, ready to work in kind of all different people. And then who knows what will happen to it. That work will be published. And then, in theory, this kind of work could be done by pretty much anybody, either above board or, on a more kind of clandestine level, because although the technology behind it is quite advanced, in that there's a lot of thinking, a lot of mathematics and computation involved in actually working out the actual model. Programming the machine isn't that difficult, it's relatively straightforward, and the kind of code that would be required to program these kind of infusion devices would be very simple to distribute, and you could buy the machine for maybe $1,000 or something. So it's not it's not a huge outlay. So I'm not encouraging people to do this, by the way, but you can imagine these underground laboratories or underground chambers where people were undergoing these 5-6 day DMT trips, and conversing with these aliens from these alternate dimensions.
I just want to make it really clear for listeners. Why would you want to make a DMT trip last several hours instead of several minutes? And you talked about these people that are trying to contact other entities through it.
I'm a scientist, but if I'm honest, I'm a bad scientist. I don't mean that I'm bad as in I'm an incompetent scientist. I mean, I'm a bad scientist, and that I do entertain ideas that other people would scoff at. Whether that's anti-scientific, no, I don't think it is. But I have a very open mind about these things, and having had personal experience with these substances, I'm much less inclined to take the orthodox position that these are, simply hallucinations. I struggle. The experience and the entities, their intelligence, their power, the inordinate complexity of this space that you are taken to when you take DMT leaves me confounded, as a scientist, and I've written about this many times. I cannot explain it within the kind of standard orthodox modern neuroscientific paradigm, which is why I do take seriously the idea that there might well be, or perhaps there is, some would say undeniably, that there are intelligences beyond the curtain, one quantum away, as Terrence McKenna said, and they're waiting. And once you cross that threshold thinking, then DMT takes on a new meaning. It's no longer a drug. It is a tool. It's a tool for gating access to normally hidden orthogonal dimensions of reality, within which a diverse panoply of highly intelligent alien beings reside. And that's astonishing. That's incredible. And if you really believe that could be true, then it's not good enough, in my opinion, to just sit on a rug and smoke a little bowl of DMT, burst into that space for a few minutes, and then get dragged back out into the consensus world after a few minutes. It's impolite, the bare minimum, right? So, but if we want to communicate with these things, bring back information. What you don't do is send someone on this roller coaster ride, and expect them to bring back meaningful information. The idea is you take them there, you let them stay there, orient themselves, get their intellective tools in order, and actually attempt to establish some kind of communication, some kind of stable communication, to actually orient themselves to navigate this space. Perhaps even to perform some sort of survey of the fauna. You can imagine the possibilities. This is we're still discovering new parts of the ocean on Earth, and we're still discovering distant parts of our universe, and they're throwing up surprises every day that we hear on the news about a new discovery from the Hubble telescope or something. But here we have a realm that it's not 100 million light years away. It's not an incomprehensible distance away. It's not deep with 100 million bars of pressure away. It's right here. It's right now. It can be accessed within 30 seconds. You can go to this place and you can stay there with this technology for as long as you want. That's, if that is really what DMT is doing, allowing you to communicate with intelligences beyond, not just beyond Earth, but actually beyond reality, beyond this dimension of reality, that is by far the most significant discovery in the history of humankind. There's no doubt about it. To be on that cutting edge, not sure that that's actually what's going on, but with a strong hunch that, that really is what you're doing when you take DMT. You really are going to some place. It really does contain autonomous beings that have their own side, right? They are conscious. They are aware of your presence, and they can communicate with you, and they're intelligent. Yeah, that's, what else would you want to do with your life, for Christ's sake?
The way you frame it, it does seem like it is really important. And, I like the comparison you make to the Hubble telescope, because they're always always discovering things that are absolutely absurd in space and in deep oceanography stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I guess I read a lot about DMT trips and everything, and people communicating, but it never really seems to be coherent. I mean, of course, I've also had a couple of my own experiences, but they weren't. I wouldn't say they were incredibly profound. Unfortunately, it's just been my own personal experience. But like I said, it's a lot of it doesn't seem very coherent. How do you decipher what's going on when there's so much variability? There's so much randomness to hyperspace.
Yeah, I think so. There's a couple of points there. So, first of all, it's not completely inconsistent. I mean, there are a large number. I always make the analogy of what if you took an alien and you dropped him onto a random position on Earth, which is, a relatively small spheroid kind of structure with a single surface. It's very, very simple compared to the kind of spaces that DMT takes you to. And then this alien went back to his alien kin on the spaceship. What would he describe? What kind of world would he describe? Well, that would depend. If he landed on the Siberian tundra, he would describe a very different world than if he landed in the middle of the street during rush hour in Tokyo, right? And he would describe very, very different worlds. So it's not surprising at all for me that when people go to these places, they experience often, extremely variable kind of spaces that they go to. But, what's more surprising is actually the commonalities and the way that people say, oh, have you been here? If you go to these chat rooms on the internet, places like DMT Nexus, people will often say, oh, have you been to this place and seen these? And people will go, yeah, I've been there. And people are actually now, there is more and more people are this kind of underground psychedelic DMT community by virtue of the internet and this ability to actually communicate now across the world very, very instantly, are actually starting to draw up a kind of map of the territory, and people describe certain places that people very often go to when they smoke DMT. The type of entities, intelligences that people often meet as well. So it's not. It is extremely variable, but it doesn't seem so variable that it's hopeless. And so I don't count out the idea that you could actually establish some kind of stable relationship with some kind of, not kind of sexual relationship. Some people go there, though, believe me, but some kind of communicative relationship with these entities. Yeah. But it's a lot of it's hypothetical at this stage. We don't really know what's going to happen when you send someone to this kind of space for these long periods of time.
I want to talk about your book, your upcoming book, Alien Information Theory. You wrote, illustrated, and typeset the whole thing, and you describe it as a textbook from the future. And I have to say, it's really beautiful. I mean, this is kind of a book that you could buy just for the photos. I've seen a proof of it. I haven't read it all yet, but I just wanted to read a short excerpt from the introduction.
Okay, fabulous.
You write, as a scientist and writer with a passion for psychoactive drugs, especially those of the psychedelic variety, I've spent most of my adult life so far thinking about the way these molecules interact with the brain to generate their remarkable effects on consciousness. Although, to a reasonably satisfying extent, this thinking often led to something approaching understanding. When confronted by DMT, my scientific mind was left reeling and utterly confounded. I simply could not explain it. There was nothing within the pages of the modern neuroscience literature that could have prepared me for DMT, and my first experience with this astonishing molecule triggered what I knew would be a lifelong dedication to its study. So, was your motivation to write this book kind of an attempt to understand your own personal DMT experiences?
Yes and no. I think I've been writing about DMT now, specifically, since 2012. And my thinking about it has evolved over that time. I wrote a paper in 2012 called Building Alien Worlds, which is also the name of my website, buildingalienworlds.com, where I tried to approach DMT from a neuroscientific perspective and try to actually say, could we really explain what DMT is doing in terms of modern neuroscience? And this led me into thinking about the way the brain constructs reality, because, of course, the world around you is constructed by your brain, in that your phenomenal world, the world as experienced, is constructed by your brain. How that relates to what's going on outside your brain is a different matter. But, whether you are awake or dreaming or the height of a DMT trip, the world is always constructed by your brain. And so this kind of led me into some really, really fascinating areas of neuroscience, and led me to kind of critically appraise this this orthodox assumption, which is really what it is, that DMT causes highly complex hallucinations, period, right? To actually analyze that, does that actually make any sense? Does that make any sense knowing what we know about the way the brain constructs our world? And I realized that it didn't, and that there was more to it, in that, the brain, as I always say, the brain wasn't dropped to earth as this pristine world-building machine. It was the brain evolved to construct this model of reality that you experience as your phenomenal world. And this world is the only world your brain knows how to build. It's evolved to construct this normal consensus phenomenal world that we're all familiar with, your own very personal world, but a world that we all agree upon to some extent. So there's no way that the brain should know how to construct this alternate model of reality with such crystalline clarity and precision. It's and just complexity. It seems I can never understand how the brain can do that unless there is some way, some means of the brain receiving information from a normally hidden source, which we would recognize as perhaps the DMT space. And so I kind of spent some time thinking about that and writing about that from that perspective. And then I became very interested in kind of working with the idea, thinking, okay, let's imagine that DMT really does allow you to communicate with alien intelligences from another reality. Can I explain that using neuroscience? Can I actually keep one foot clearly within what's known about the way the brain works, and actually try and explain what's going on with DMT? And so that's really what my work with regards to DMT has been doing over these last few years. And then, as I write in the introduction, I return to one of my favorite mechanisms, which again is in the introduction and on the back of the book, which is the main thing to understand is that we are imprisoned in some kind of work of art. And as I write in the introduction, that thing, it's a very, very strange thing for someone to say. What does he mean by we're imprisoned in a work of art? How could that be possible? And so, but I kind of had that little aphorism in the back of my mind for a number of years, and I began to think about what that really could mean. In that, perhaps DMT is this technology that's actually been embedded within our reality, that allows us to communicate with this hyper intelligence, if you like, that is in some way responsible for the structure of our reality. And that's really what the book is about. So the book is more than just a book about DMT and the way DMT works, although there's a lot of that in there. That's necessary for the complete picture. But the idea is, let's imagine that our reality is structured in a certain way. And I use the model of digital physics for this, because I think it's the most, doesn't have to be digital physics, but it's the simplest to explain, and that the fundamental ground of reality in digital physics is information, which I take great pains to explain in the book exactly what I mean by information, and the way that patterns of information can complexify from the ground of reality, and through many layers of hierarchical organization to form the extremely complex structures that we see around us, including ourselves. So our world is constructed from information that's constructed by our brain, and our brain itself is a complex orchestration, an information complex, I call it, which is built from simpler patterns of information that we refer to as neurons, and then down to the molecules and the atoms, and you get layers of this complexification of information. And the reason this is a really neat way of thinking about reality is because at the ground of reality you have something that can be encoded, which means that the ground of reality, the rules that dictate the way information complexifies, what we would recognize as the laws of physics, can also be encoded, which means that our entire universe, our entire world, our entire reality can be encoded using some kind of fundamental code. And this fundamental code generates the fundamental structure of our reality, perhaps with many, 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 many different variants. And then these variants of our fundamental reality, what physicists might call the multiverse, would evolve and self-complexify over time, and then a very, very small fraction would actually give rise to complexity, stable complex structures such as living organisms, such as ourselves. And so we find ourselves the product of, built from information, but information that is complexified over many, many levels and layers of organization. And the idea is that you would have a hyper intelligence that would generate the initial code that would create all of these universes, and then we find ourselves within one. And what DMT is it's a kind of tool that's been implanted or embedded in our reality to enable us to, first of all, to communicate with that high dimensional space that essentially was the genesis of our reality, and then eventually perhaps even to transfer our consciousness, to transcribe the informational structure of our consciousness into this higher dimensional space. So I call this the game, in that it's the game of the cosmic, this huge kind of cosmic game, in that you emerge within this lower dimensional space, and then over time you become intelligent enough, you reach this certain level of cognitive sophistication and technological acumen that you can identify this technology. So the technology is everywhere. It's in basically pretty much every plant, to varying levels of concentration. But it's scattered across the natural world. But it takes a certain degree of intelligence, quite high intelligence, to actually identify DMT, identify the technology, to isolate it in a form that can be used, and then to develop it as a technology, using perhaps this continuous infusion technology that I've developed. And then the idea would be that using this technology, humans would actually be able to transfer their lower dimensional consciousness into this higher dimensional space. And essentially we would be, hyperdimensional citizens of hyperspace, if you like. So it's kind of like interdimensional citizenship is really the name of the game. And that's really what the book is about. So there's a lot of speculation, but it's a vision of reality, if you like. I don't mean like a vision as in I saw it during a DMT trip, although certainly there are aspects of this way of thinking about the world that definitely did come from DMT. When you speak to people that have smoked a lot of DMT, they often say, "Oh, I saw the fundamental structure of reality. I saw these fundamental pieces, these cubes or something, that were interacting and organizing and stuff." And they seem to get this impression about the fundamental structure of reality, this kind of digital nature of reality. So that's the book, really. All the way from how the universe was constructed, all the way through to how we might escape it at the end.
Well, it's awesome, and I'm looking forward to reading it. I have to admit, I'm a bit skeptical of some of the premises in the book, but I do find them really interesting and unique and worth considering. I'm not Joe Rogan, and I don't think you're Alex Jones, because he was, of course, on the show recently saying something about. I didn't actually watch it myself. I had better things to do, but I wonder if you maybe encounter a lot of stigma or resistance to some of these theories. That smoking DMT can allow you to talk to aliens.
Yeah, of course, yeah, absolutely. I mean, some people think, fortunately for me, most people are just fascinated more than anything, and they find the whole thing completely bizarre. What I would call, there's some kind of intellectual antagonism from some people, but most people aren't openly hostile. There are exceptions to that. People think, and you get the occasional comment on your YouTube channel about you telling that you're talking nonsense and stuff, and they will then offer their own explanation for things. But yeah, I don't really care to an extent. This is one of the reasons why I wrote the book as I did, as I explain in the introduction, which, if you're going to buy the book, read the fucking introduction, for goodness sake, because it kind of explains my position. There's a number of ways you can go about this kind of thing. You can say, at the one extreme, you can give a comprehensive, balanced, scientific critical analysis of the evidence, right, for this and for that. That's a very technical book. It's interesting for sure, but that's just one way to approach it. The opposite end is to write a science fiction novel. And just, that you're creating a world, that's the way it works. So this is why I call it a textbook from the future, is I wanted to sit in this very strange place between a scientific textbook and a science fiction novel, in that it's written there's nothing in there that I've made up, in that the science isn't made up, but I've taken pieces and perhaps arranged them in a way and have been quite definitive about certain things that some people would say, hey, hold on, digital physics isn't accepted. It's a fringe area of physics. Yeah, it's a fundamental theory of physics, but it's most people are interested in string theory, right? So you need to do with strings, So yeah, there is, I decided I would write it as if everything in the book was 100%. No, as if I was an alien that knew the structure of reality and the way that everything works. Then I imagine, how would I write this textbook and explain to Earthlings, if you like, how the whole system works. So that's the kind of narrator, if you like, that tells this story. It's not my normally critical, balanced scientist. It's somebody that has said, okay, let's imagine this is true. How would this appear? How would you write about this? How would you explain it? So it's admittedly it's a strange book, and I'm aware that some people are going to come to the book and go, that's ridiculous. How can he make that claim? It's absurd. How's he going to back that up? And I'm going to get a lot of antagonism, and I am expecting that. I really do expect that. I expect some people will say, this is an irresponsible book. People had some pretty nasty things to say about Rick Strassman after his study. Rick Strassman, the most important DMT researcher, in history, really. And as you say, he really sparked this new sort of psychedelic renaissance. So yeah, he deserves huge respect for that. But he made some claims in his book. He said that DMT was he speculated that DMT was produced by the pineal gland, and that it's released at death, that it marks the exit of the soul from the body, and this kind of thing. And then people kind of read the book and then thought, oh, that's true, or that's the way it works. And then people say, actually, no. There's no evidence that the pineal produces psychedelic quantities of DMT. There's no evidence that DMT causes dreams. Again, that's another idea that goes back to a guy called Jace Calloway, who wrote a paper back in I think it was in the 80s. But anyway, it was a while ago. He speculated that perhaps endogenous tryptamines were responsible for dreams, which I don't think is true at all. The DMT state is nothing like regular dreaming. It has no relationship in terms of its phenomenology or structure. But with me, I've gone even further. I've written a book. If you don't read the introduction, realize where I'm coming from, then people are gonna tear it apart and say, "Oh, this is bullshit. This is nonsense. How dare you say that? You're gonna, and there is a small risk, I guess, that you're gonna spawn this new generation of people that think everything that I've written in this book is 100% proven or something. But yeah, fuck it. I wrote the book, and it was very intuitive the way I wanted to do it, and it's all come together with, as I say, with sort of 7 years of thinking about DMT and writing about DMT, and then this coherent narrative appeared in my head, and I thought, fuck it, I'm just going to write this down and produce this book, and this is the result.
Well, I appreciate that you're not an evangelist about some of the more out there claims of the book. But what evidence, I'm sure you go over this in detail in the book, but what evidence do you provide for people that are a little more skeptical and think that, a DMT trip is just a hallucination, it's nothing real? Well,
so we can approach this from a number of different angles. So I guess, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we know about the way that the world is constructed. We know the way that the phenomenal world is constructed, which I go into a lot of detail. in that it is constructed from information, and that information is generated by the brain. And this applies, under all circumstances. So the brain learns to construct this model of reality over these millions of years of evolution, basically. So the fact that you're able to go to these places that have no relationship whatsoever to the consensus world, that are, they're not kind of maelstroms of confusion and disorder, but they are, once you get past the initial phase of the experience, these are kind of stable, solid, reasonably, stable, complex, well-formed structures that are, replete with this huge range, diverse range of intelligences. That is very, very difficult to explain as a neuroscientist, because I cannot explain how the brain knows how to do that. Why, when you ingest such a simple molecule, the brain would suddenly reorganize its behavior to construct these astonishingly complex environments. So that's the key thing for me. Is simply thinking about the way that the brain works. And that's something I mention, but I don't spend a lot of time. If you read some of my other papers, particularly my Building Alien Worlds paper, which is really probably my most important, and my first paper where I spoke about DMT, I spend a lot more time discussing these things. But it's one has to be go into enough detail, but not to get bogged down. There's a lot of ground to cover. So in 230 odd pages, we go from the fundamental structure of reality all the way through how to escape this universe, and a lot in between. And as you said as well, every page is designed and typeset and illustrated with this pixel art. You can see it. It's kind of it's very, very time consuming, and so I wanted to make a book that contained all the information but was reasonably concise. If that makes sense. Yeah.
So if you are going to talk to these beings in this hyperdimensional omniverse, as you put it, what kind of message would you want to bring to them, or what are some of the messages that people have heard from the other end?
That's a really good question. So, people often ask, what would you actually ask them, or what kind of information would you want to get back? I often talk about doing experiments in this place. People haven't really discussed that. What kind of experiments would you do? Would you approach this with a scientific mind and try to, establish the reality of these beings? That's perhaps one of the most, I guess if you were one of these intelligences, perhaps slightly more insulting ideas, is that these little lower dimensional sprites would pop into your world and try to do experiments on you, or ask you to answer questions to prove that you exist. It would be, but that's what people have proposed, right? The idea that you would go into this space and that you would give these beings very, very difficult mathematical problems and say, okay, what are the prime factors of this number? And that they would go, oh, it's these, this, and this, and you go, correct. You exist. And we fucking know we exist. We created you. So it's to be honest, it's that's the kind of thing that needs to be worked out. Is yes, we want to go there. Yeah, we want to communicate, but I think it would take the expertise of people from a diverse number of fields. You would need linguists, you would need anthropologists, you would need perhaps even sociologists of a certain ilk, at least. You would need mathematicians, you would need neuroscientists, you would, psychologists. You would need people to sit around a table and say, okay, we've established that there's this extremely intelligent alien species that are sitting behind this veil. We have access to them. We have stable access. What are we going to ask them? What kind of information are we interested in? What do we want to do with that information? Do we just want information that, in kind of in the vein of what people think about with extraterrestrials, right? The idea that they would give us free energy propulsion technologies or things like that. Fabulous, great stuff. But I think when you're dealing with beings from outside this reality, then that kind of is that the kind of information really that we are best attempting to harvest? I think the first thing would be to actually do as you would with anyone. When you first meet a new species, you don't go to somewhere, you don't trample through the Amazon rainforest and find a new tribe and say, hey, how the fuck did you build that? You go, hi, who are you? Tell me about yourself. Where did you come from? You would be those kind of things. That would be my intuition. Now, there might be experts on these things saying, no, that's not how you approach it. But these are the kind of people we need, right? It's like, how do you establish communication with a hyper-intelligent being from an alternate dimension? And I think that's not a trivial question to answer, unfortunately.
But yeah, it's really interesting. It's really making me think about things in a totally different way.
That's the idea.
I guess I would consider myself like a psychonaut or whatever, but I'm really interested in these realms, I should say, but I'm skeptical. And
as you should be, as you should be. But there's difference, of course, between being skeptical, as you are, and people who are just dismissive.
Yeah.
And they're not particularly interesting to talk to. Until the great convincer, as Terrence McKenna always pointed out, the great convincer is 10 minutes and a glass pipe. That's the only way. That's the only way. And then people very often will change their fucking minds pretty damn quickly.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I think that's a good place to end it. Was there anything else that you wanted to talk about or let people know?
No, other than the book is out on April 16th. And you can order via my website. But there's not many copies left. It's easier, actually, because I have to send them all the way from Okinawa, and it's complicated. But anyway, or you can go to Amazon and you can pre-order the book now, globally, basically.
You should also mention you can find Andrew on Twitter at Alien Insect or buildingalienworlds.com.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. It's really great to talk to you.
You're welcome.
Thanks for listening to Narcotica. Narcotica is an independent production by Christopher Moraff, Zachary Siegel, and myself, Troy Farah. Our co-producer is Aaron Ferguson, and our theme music is by Glassboy. Additional music by Aaron Ferguson. You can follow us on Twitter at Narcocast or on narcocast.com. If you like the program and you want to support us, there are a few ways you can help. Tell a friend about us. Most podcasts become popular via word of mouth, or give us a decent rating on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Second, you can become a patron at patreon.com/narcotica, where you'll get access to exclusive bonus content and help us pay our bills a little bit. We are so grateful for the people that make this program possible. We want to stay ad-free, and you guys help us do that. Thank you so much. If you've encountered otherworldly beings on DMT, why don't you tell us about it? Shoot us an email at tips@narcocast.com. That's all for now. Take care.